Hi, this is Sabrina from the Learning Content Accessibility Spotlight Group, and welcome to our guest feature series where we dig deeper into accessibility topics and answer your questions. Our guest today is Star Peterson, and we are going to talk about making learning content friendly to neurodivergent learners. Star is an instructional designer and trainer and specializes in diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility training. And some of her training includes neurodivergence and invisible disabilities. So, Star, before we start, could you introduce yourself or tell us more about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with Stellar Diversity Training, and as you said, my specialties are in invisible disabilities, neurodiversity, as well as LGBTQIA plus issues. And I also work as an instructional designer and an e-learning developer.
Okay, that's awesome. So for our topic today, you have a slide, a deck
Yes.
prepared for us, and you're going to go ahead and share and talk more.
Absolutely. Well, this presentation is called Supporting Neurodiverse Learners. As she said, I'm Star Peterson. I have a master's degree in special education as well as multiple forms of neurodivergence. I want to start with defining a few basic terms. A neurotype is basically a type of brain wiring, for lack of a technical term. When we say neurodiversity, we just mean that there's a lot of different types, different neurotypes. When we say neurotypical, we refer to people whose brain works the way the majority of brains work, and in the ways in which our society is designed to accommodate. Neurodivergent means people who aren't neurotypical. Here are just a few examples of neurodivergence. Some people are born with, some are acquired, such as traumatic brain injury. Again, this is just a partial list, but it does include cognitive disabilities, such as intellectual disabilities. So there are a lot of challenges that neurodivergent learners can face. This includes things like attention, auditory discrimination and processing, concentration, executive dysfunction, which is the cognitive processes that are involved in goal setting, planning, and organization, memory, sensory sensitivity, and visual discrimination. Well, a lot of the strategies we'll talk about are especially good for helping with attention, but we will try to address all of these different challenges and ways to address them. I want to start with just a few basic do's and don'ts before we dive in. Your font choice is going to make a big difference in terms of for people who are dyslexic, as well as for people who are visually impaired. This font that I use for everything I do is Atkinson Hyperlegible, and it's a free font that you can download that's specifically for people who are visually impaired. You want to use at least a 12-point font and camel case. So that means not all caps or all lowercase, but uppercase letters when appropriate. You want 1.5 line spacing, and you want to use bold for emphasis rather than italics or underlining. You want single color backgrounds. Using the active voice also really helps people understand. So active voice means I walked the dog. Passive voice would be the dog was walked by me. So if you can dig back to your days of English class, active voice is easier for people to understand and is considered the APA style. Bullet points are super helpful for segmenting information. That's great for people who have trouble processing large pieces of information or just remembering it. Numbering helps a lot with organization, which can be a big challenge for a lot of neurodivergent people. So that's recommended as well. And left alignment makes it easier for people to just take in things visually. So a few things you'll want to avoid: large blocks of text, which again, we often want to avoid that in e-learning anyway. We want to give lots of fun ways for people to interact with our learning. Avoid underlining and italics. Like we said, we'll use bold instead. Don't use all caps. Don't have long sentences or multiple columns. Multiple columns can just be tricky for people visually to take in. You also don't want to use centered text or text justification. Text justification is when you space the letters apart so that the edges of each line are parallel to the sides of the page. And it can make the spacing between words and letters inconsistent, and that can be hard for some people to take in. Again, we want to avoid the passive voice. You want to avoid using abbreviations unless they're super common in the field, obviously. But if it's something that you're not sure that everyone is going to know like the back of their hand, you're going to make sure you don't abbreviate it. At least not, the first couple times you use it. Staying away from glossy paper is another important thing if you're handing out, say, notes for your instructor-led training. That's also the shine is going to make it difficult for people to take in the information. So a lot of the things that are best practices for creating learning for neurodivergent learners line up really well with Mayer's principles of multimedia learning. So I'm going to go over the principles that are especially important for engaging and retaining our neurodivergent learners. So the first is the pre-training principle. Just says that learners learn more efficiently if they already know some of the basics. So you want to define definitions, terms, concepts ahead of time. We'll talk about different forms of training. And one great way to give this pre-training is through micro-learning, just giving people ahead of time a few basics at a time in small segments so that they can retain it, and just having that as a lead up to the bulk of the training. The segmenting principle just means that we learn best when information is presented in segments rather than in one long stream. For this reason, you'll want to make sure you have next buttons and that any videos, any learning can be controlled, that learners can pause them, rewind to go back and listen to something they didn't understand or didn't catch. And again, that helps your learner break the video into segments that are the easiest to digest for their neurotype. The signaling principle just tells us to make it really clear what we're supposed to be paying attention to. So you can use arrows, you can highlight important information, you can use bold text. The multimedia principle just tells us that people learn best from words that are accompanied by pictures rather than just words by themselves. Just make sure that your images enhance the information or clarify it. The modality principle just tells us that we learn best from visuals that go with spoken words. More than we do from visuals that only have printed words. Now, you don't want to put everything you're going to say on a slide, obviously, but having someone speaking and having a minimum of words on the slide is going to be a lot easier for your learners to retain than not having any audio and just doing the reading. Also, keep in mind that if there's too much text, it can be overwhelming for some of your neurodivergent learners. The spatial contiguity principle says that we learn best when relevant text and visuals are physically close together. So like you can see here, The picture is physically close to the title. The redundancy principle just tells us that we don't want to be redundant in terms of our text and our audio. Once again, we don't want to have all of our text on the screen that's being said in the audio. You do always want your learners to have the option to turn captions on or off. But don't say everything, don't write everything on the screen that you're going to say. So I'm going to talk about some specific techniques for different types of training that will help engage your neurodivergent learners. And I hope you're seeing that a lot of this really is good for everybody. Certainly, none of these practices are going to be a detriment to anyone. When you're choosing the type of training for your learners, whenever possible, give multiple choices in terms of ways to access the training. So some people are going to have a really hard time concentrating unless they're right there in person, whereas other people, say someone with a sensory processing disorder, is going to really struggle in instructor-led training if someone in the room has a strong perfume or the light is too bright, or so these people are going to learn more from other options. So again, whenever possible, give people an option of how they want to learn. With instructor-led training, you're going to want to think a lot about sensory processing differences. 70% of autistics have a sensory processing disorder, although most people with a sensory processing disorder are not autistic. But the sensory processing disorder basically means a lot of your senses can feel really turned up. So just it being too warm in the room can be so distracting that learners can't pay attention to the training. Fluorescent lights can be really problematic for a lot of people, just the sound of them, the type of light. So if you're doing an instructor-led training, make sure you don't have fluorescent lights. Use some kind of like lamp lighting, or natural light is always a lot easier for neurodivergent people to take in than the fluorescent lights, and it doesn't make the noise. I always encourage people to put out fidget toys. Again, some of your neurodivergent learners are going to learn better if they're playing with something. It's going to be a lot easier for them to pay attention. And if you put out fidget toys for everyone, it makes it more socially acceptable. Always allow breaks that are long enough that people can actually get up and move around. This is going to be huge in terms of attention for your learners. And make sure you're asking questions so that you can maintain engagement, but give learners time to respond. Some of your neurodivergent learners are going to need more processing time than your neurotypical learners in order to figure out how to respond to a question. So don't just, call on the first person who raises their hand. Give everyone time to think and process, and then choose someone to answer out loud. Or again, if you're having people write down their answers, that's another thing. Just, give processing time. Within virtual instructor-led training, do not insist that your learners turn their videos on. I know it's tempting. I certainly prefer when I give talks to see people's faces. And I know that employers often want to make sure that people are there and, paying attention. But for people who need to stim in order to pay attention, they're just not going to be comfortable with their video on. Some people are going to be so distracted by just seeing themselves on the screen, or so aware of other people seeing them, that that's going to get in the way of them learning. So I always tell people to provide the option of having the video off. When you're asking learners to respond during VILT, make sure they can respond either out loud or in writing. Again, some people are going to process differently, and it's going to be easier for them to communicate with their instructor in writing versus out loud. And for some people, it can be the other way around. So we want to make sure all of our learners can be engaged. With e-learning, make sure there's always the option to turn off the sound. Narration is great for people who need it, but if for people who don't need it, having that additional auditory stimulation can be really overwhelming. So give people the option to turn off the sound, whether it's narration or a video. Again, options is just an ongoing theme because different things are going to work for different people. Just like there's no one neurotype, there's no one solution that's going to work for all neurodivergent learners. So make sure that if there's a video that needs to be watched as part of the content, give them the option of reading instead. Obviously, with the video, you'll want to have closed captions option, but make sure that if at all possible, you have that auditory description that you would often use for accessibility anyway for people with visual accessibility needs, so that people have the option of reading instead of watching the video. And again, if they're watching that video, they need to be able to pause so they can stop and think about something or look up a term, and again, learn at their own pace. And as always, to maintain attention, you want to make your e-learning as interactive as possible, just like with other types of learning. This is going to make a huge difference, especially for your learners who have ADHD. Microlearning is, I think, great for neurodivergent learners. I love that it breaks things into smaller segments, which is one of the main things we want to do with our information to make it easier to digest and to remember. Microlearning is great for review, so this can really help your learners, such as learners with traumatic brain injuries who have memory problems. I've used microlearning in a few different ways. You can use it for pre-training before you have the bulk of a training, your learners can receive little bits of microlearning that remind them of some definitions or give them the groundwork that they're going to need to walk in with. You can also use it after the main training as review. Just once a day for a week, learners get a few slides to go through with questions to answer. It's really easy to make microlearning interactive, which is another one of our goals for reaching our neurodivergent learners. So there's all sorts of microlearning platforms out there. That's a whole different discussion, but many of them will give a lot of different options for assessment. So it could be multiple choice, it could be true, false. Again, we're looking for those options so that we can reach more learners.
So I have a question
yes,
about pre-training and microlearning. Do you also apply this do you only apply to instructor-led training or also to any of your e-learnings, the pre-training part?
Yes, any training. I mean, you can have the pre-training as the first section of your e-learning if the only access you're getting to learners is this one-shot, 30-minute RISE course. But absolutely, any type of learning. We want our learners to come in already having time to digest the important blocks of what they're going to be learning.
Okay.
So yeah, let's say it's new hire training and there are some acronyms that you use a lot in your industry, you're going to want them to have those down pat before you start the main training.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So we want to think about our neurodivergent learners through every step of the learning development process. During the analysis phase, when you're making your learner profile, make it someone who has multiple forms of neurodivergence. When you're thinking about behavioral outcomes, make sure there's multiple options for demonstrating knowledge. Different people with different types of neurodivergence may struggle with showing their knowledge or expressing it in certain ways. Think about learning constraints that are going to be relevant to neurodivergent learners, and think about delivery options. Are people going to have the option between instructor-led training or e-learning, things like that? When you're designing, just think about how, as of course, we always think about how we're going to assess then. So think about how you're going to make sure your neurodivergent learners can show what they know, even if certain types of questions are going to be more difficult for them, not because of the content, but because of the structure of the question. When you're developing your training, if you're including a facilitator's guide, make sure that you give them information about accommodating neurodivergent learners. So again, if this is a facilitator's guide for an instructor-led training, you'll want to make sure that they know to check on things like lights and temperature, and making sure that people can sit far enough apart from each other that that's not going to be a source of discomfort. Just other considerations that are going to make a huge difference. Auditory discrimination can be difficult for certain neurodivergent people. So if you're writing a facilitator's guide for an instructor who's doing training in person, make sure that they know to find a room where there's not going to be that background noise. That's just going to be huge. When you're implementing, again, make sure that you people have the option to turn off the video. And again, think about that environment and how people with sensory processing disorders might experience that environment. And then when you get to the evaluation stage, you want multiple ways to show mastery of content. If you're doing something like fill in the blank, make sure that the learner isn't going to get something wrong just because the spelling is difficult. I think, fill in the blank can be pretty popular even when they don't have options to choose from, so it's not as much a multiple choice, but it's really just entering the answer. So just keep that in mind.
So do you have any, we came to questions, but do you have any favorite ways for evaluation that you use for neurodiverse learners?
I just use a wide variety because there's no one way that's going to be best. So multiple choice, matching, true, false, all of the standard types that you see in e-learning, just, again, a wide variety. So I'm not going to just do multiple choice or just do true, false. Because large amounts of text can be overwhelming for a lot of our neurodivergent learners. For multiple choice, I only give 3 answers to choose from rather than 4.
Okay, that makes sense. So we do have a couple of questions from the community,
Yes.
and I can, let me go ahead and take a look. I think you answered quite a few or most of them, in your presentation, which was great.
Right.
And one of the questions is what are some of the unique strengths and talents that neurodiverse learners might bring to the table, and how can we harness that in a learning environment?
A lot of our neurodivergent learners are going to be exceptionally intelligent. Things like there's a lot of evidence that many autistic people, for example, are exceptionally intelligent. Some psychiatric illnesses, such as bipolar disorder, are often co-occur with really exceptional amounts of creativity. So I would say draw upon that intelligence and that creativity so that to help your learners thrive, so that you're really being strengths focused.
And another question was, is there a difference between neurodiversity, cognitive disabilities, and learning disabilities?
Yes, so neurodiversity is going to be the umbrella term. Cognitive disabilities are things we think of, like we used to use the term mental retardation. We don't use that specific phrase anymore, but that would be under the cognitive disabilities umbrella. Learning disabilities is a type of neurodiversity and can be things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. So they're all related. They're all forms of neurodiversity.
Okay. So the best method to, when we are creating any kind of training, one is Mayer's principles. And also,
Yes.
I think in terms of WCAG, terms of, like the navigation, how important is like navigation and structuring your content? Would that help the learners too?
That's both really important. Organization is extremely important for helping people um, just understand the content, and absolutely navigation. Your learners have got to be able to control the navigation. If it's e-learning, make sure that they're controlling the pace of when they skip to the next slide. Um, Make sure that they can pause videos or rewind to hear them again. Make sure that they can go back to another part of the training if they get to a word they don't remember. So yeah, both of those are huge for making your training accessible to neurodivergent learners.
Excellent. And then, what are there any resources, our community could look up to get a better understanding of neurodiversity?
I'm blanking on the name.
That's okay. You can
Jan, I'm
send it
sorry.
to me.
Askjan.org is a great resource for all sorts of different interventions. You can search by disability. You can also search by a specific challenge. So askjan.org focuses a lot on workplace accommodations. So apps that are going to help people who have memory or organizational difficulties, for example. So that's the number one place that I recommend people, because it's just very practical. It's not about theory. It makes it really easy to explain to your stakeholders if there are certain things that you need funding for to offer in order to offer to your learners. It makes it really easy to explain, okay, this addresses difficulties that people with working memory have, or that people with attention have. So yeah, for sure, askjan.org.
That sounds like an excellent resource. I'm going to definitely look it up, and
Yeah.
I will add it to a list of resources when we publish this interview with you. And if our learners want to connect with you, where could they do so?
They can reach out to me on LinkedIn, or they can go to my website, stellardiversitytraining.com, and I'm happy to talk to anyone who'd like to learn more about this.
Okay, thank you so much. So, Star, I would really like to thank you for, coming and talking to our community and helping us learning more about neurodiversity. And this has been a really helpful talk. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.